Hi there, welcome back. This week we're going to examine the role that international organisations play in the world economy. And we're going to do this by developing several of the strands that we've examined already in this course. Now in this first video, we're going to trace the roots of the current system of international organisations. Now just for historical accuracy, and I am a historian, I have to mention that the first truly international organisation was the International Telegraph Union, created in 1865 to establish common standards for international telegraph communication. And close on its heels came the General Postal Union, created in 1874 to establish common rates for international postage, to ensure that post in one country was actually delivered in another, and to establish the precedent that a country in which the mail was posted and the stamps were bought, that they could keep the revenues. And both of these bodies still exist today under the umbrella of the United Nations. But the roots of the current international order lie in the failure of international organisations in the interwar years. After the end of the First World War, the victorious nations had, in 1920, created the League of Nations. This was an international body designed primarily to guarantee peace and security by encouraging negotiation and arbitration to resolve international disputes. By the time it collapsed into a Second World War, it was evident that the League had catastrophically failed to fulfill this primary aim. Now, several reasons have been offered for this failure. Firstly, the fact that the United States had failed from the start to join the organisation robbed it of some of its legitimacy and clout. But given the fact that American policy was becoming increasingly isolationist anyway, it's difficult to say what difference its membership would have made to the course of events. Now, secondly, when countries considered that their expansionist national ambitions were being threatened, they simply left the organisation. Germany did this in 1933 when the Nazis came to power. Japan walked out in the same year after the condemnation of its invasion of Manchuria. And Italy abandoned the League in 1937 following the invasion of Abyssinia. Now, less well known but equally important are the activities of the League of Nations in the field of economics. After the dismemberment of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the First World War, the successor states adopted aggressive protectionist trade policies as they tried to recreate viable national economies. The League held a succession of conferences designed to bring down the level of import tariffs, all without success. Again, after the onset of the Great Depression, the League tried, again without success, to halt the upward drift of restrictive trade measures such as tariffs and quotas, as countries tried to isolate their national economies from the downward global spiral. Once again, following the devaluation of sterling in 1931, the League tried and failed to discourage the manipulation of exchange rates to secure national trade advantages. And finally, in 1933, it called a large international conference in London designed to bring all of these issues together and link them together. Well, it collapsed, and with its collapse, the League finally abandoned its ambitions in this direction. Again, several reasons have been advanced to explain the failure. Firstly, there always seemed to be a problem about agreeing a strategy towards tackling trade and financial issues. At a slightly deeper level was the fact that the groundwork for discussions was never adequately prepared in advance. The League never had sufficient staff, and more important still, nobody seemed to see the need for a bigger staff. League officials never saw it as their task to prepare detailed recommendations, partly because it was reluctant to interfere with domestic policy matters. Now, this reluctance to overstep some invisible line between commercial policy on the one hand and general economic policy on the other also contributed to an artificial compartmentalization of problems. Commercial policy was an integral part of economic policy as a whole, or at least it was rapidly becoming so. Now, among American policymakers surveying this collapse of collective security and the disintegration of the world economy, there was a general mindset that linked the war directly to the Depression. The Great Depression had contributed to a rise of protectionism, and behind these protectionist barriers, dictatorships had been able to emerge, and this in turn had led directly to the war. post-war policy should be directed at avoiding any reoccurrence. You've also got to remember that the ruling Democrats, led by President Roosevelt, had already promoted widespread government intervention in the national economy in the form of the New Deal, and they were ready to employ the same approach to international problems. So, during the various meetings among the Allies held in the closing years of the war, President Roosevelt gave a high priority to the creation of a new world order, one to which the United States would be committed, and one which would also include the Soviet Union. And this work was continued after his death. Now, anchoring the entire structure would be the United Nations. Its highest body would be the Security Council, which would be primarily responsible for maintaining world peace. And there's one aspect, however, we won't be discussing in this series of lectures. Trade and employment issues would be entrusted to an international trade organization. Monetary questions would fall under the remit of an international monetary fund, and problems of post-war reconstruction will be tackled for 2 years by a UN Relief and Aid Administration, and when its mandate had lapsed, responsibility for promoting economic development would fall to the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, commonly known as the World Bank. Okay, let's sum up now. In this lecture, we've seen how the failure of international organizations to preserve peace and promote prosperity in the interwar years had prompted a change in the American view of a new world order, and how this in turn had led to the creation of new specialized agencies under the umbrella of the United Nations. Over the next 3 videos, we'll examine in turn the development of these agencies in the field of trade on the one hand and finance on the other, and in the final video, we'll reflect on what lessons we can draw from their experience.